I think it's
Okay,
slightly.
slide.
Try to refresh it. It's like
30 seconds बाद आएगा इसमें तो
So I think we are live because the
yeah,
timer
yes, ma'am. We
is.
are live. People are watching. Okay.
Yeah.
We're
So
watching.
you start.
Yes. A very good evening to one and all present here. Hope you all are well. We, the team of Funky Bar, welcome to you all today's event. Today, Dr. Sneha Chaudhuri, a renowned scholar working as an assistant professor of English at West Bengal State University and guest faculty at Department of English, Chaudhuri University, is present with us. We are grateful to have you, ma'am. She is going to enlighten our knowledge on gender, crime, and performance in Peter Ackroyd's novels. She is formerly assistant editor and current editorial board member of New Victorian Studies, UK. Her areas of specialization include New Victorian Studies, Victorian literature, postmodern, post-colonial fiction. Her postdoctoral research interests are adaptation studies, gender studies, trauma studies, and popular culture and films. She has published book chapters and scholarly articles in various reputed, peer-reviewed national and international journals, and edited volume published by Sage, Anthem Press, Swansea University, Sambalpur University, Jadavpur University, Sri Samya Ananda Publishers. Her co-edited volume entitled Tagore's Ideas of the New Woman, The Making and Unmaking of Female Subjectivity, has been published internationally by Sage and Sri Samya in 2017. She has also visited several universities abroad like Harvard, University of California, Pittsburgh, Leicester, Portsmouth, Brighton, Lincolnshire, De Montfort, Malaga and Sydney for conference presentations. Many students under her guidance have successfully completed their MA, dissertations, PhD and MPhil. It's our pleasure that you came, ma'am. We are eagerly waiting to hear you. Over to you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, Anuradha, for this very kind introduction and for inviting me in your platform. Really, it's a Sunday evening and people would like to watch the IPL on TV, but I'm sure that there are other people who are logged in and they would like to hear about this very interesting Victorian woman about whom Peter Ackroyd has written this novel. And I'm very happy to be able to speak about Peter Ackroyd, about whom I have written articles, but I've never spoken about him anywhere. And since in India and in largely in the Indian subcontinent, I've seen for the past so many years that when I was even a student at the Department of English, Chaudhuri University, that after having done some amount of reading in modern fiction and maybe till postmodern fiction, till the writings of Angela Carter or John Fowles, after the 60s and 70s, the curriculum in the Indian subcontinent generally did not have as much an adequate coverage of British fiction or literature. And what we have rather, especially the post imperial phase of the 70s and 80s, where many interesting things were happening. But since there was again this empire writes back onslaught of post colonial studies, the rise of post-colonial studies, and therefore there was a kind of a curricular and ideological imperative to focus more on post-colonial novels from all over the world. So again, when we know of writers and when in my class I teach postmodern fiction, when I do John Fowles and I discuss A.S. Byatt and I refer to Graham Swift and Nicholas Shakespeare, or I say I will discuss Peter Ackroyd, then I have often seen that my students are not even acquainted with their names. And that is slightly very disappointing because these writers, having had made it to the Booker list and have won several Bookers to their name, uh, even Graham Swift is like seen as somebody who's a Booker winner, is perceived as somebody who's maybe just a descendant of Jonathan Swift, which he is not. So that general, and even Nicholas Shakespeare, that maybe he is some descendant of Shakespeare, which is again not. And so you see that that kind of a lack of knowledge and curricular exposure, and somehow there is a kind of a huge leap from the modern and the postmodern to the post-colonial and the post-imperial, and something that happens in between in British literature is often missing. Especially in courses in Indian universities and maybe in the entire subcontinent. So when I talk about Peter Ackroyd, I basically talk about a novelist who is prolific as a writer of historical fiction, and he's also someone who has the credit of having had written historical fiction about all the major ages of British history. Like he writes about the medieval Chaucerian times in his Clerkenwell Tales. He has written extensively about the Renaissance when he has written a novel like The House of Dr. D. And then he has written novels like Hawksmoor, which is quite a well known name, which is a detective novel set in the 18th century. And then, of course, he has given a lot of exposure to the Romantic period by writing novels like Chatterton. And in the Victorian period also, he has located many of his novels, like The Last Testament of Oscar Wilde, as I'm going to discuss this novel, Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, and of course his mammoth biography of Dickens, which was published in 2002, where he not only writes about the life of Dickens as any biographer would, but there he also inserts a kind of a theory that he himself maintains in relation to unquote unquote what he calls the London tradition. And now, by saying this London tradition, he means to say that British literature, see, or and even art and paintings, since the time of Bunyan or Thomas More, has had a tradition of representing city life the way we find it in the paintings of Hogarth or in the paintings of Turner and in the novels of Dickens, of Reynolds, and also in the prose writings of Henry Mayhew. And he's saying that he wants to revive and write about that kind of a London tradition novel, which he does write in Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem. Now, when I say that I would discuss this kind of an interface of gender, crime, and all kinds of very seedy activities that happen in the London underworld, then I also mean to say that it's a kind of a novel which portrays a protagonist who is largely a very questionable and violent character. But again, where we have to see that when Peter Ackroyd writes these historical novels, he writes this novel, this is published in 1994. So when he's writing about the 19th century, which is almost, say, he's writing about a time which is located 100 years before he starts writing this novel. There, he is trying to expel the ways in which normative Victorian fiction, if you think of Victorian fiction in terms of, say, the typical ones of those by Wilkie Collins, or by Reynolds, or by even the women writers like Mary Braddon of the sensational school. And then, of course, Dickens used many of these motifs and these kinds of narratives from sensation crime novels, especially his Bleak House, which has this Lady Deadlock plot, which is a crime, nearing a bordering a crime thriller. And then, of course, we have the world of Oliver Twist, where there is Fagin and this dark underworld, which is described. So the novels of Dickens and, of course, of Reynolds and Mary Baden and Wilkie Collins, they would construct a certain kind of a criminal environment, which was very popular in the fictional subgenres of that period, especially the common people, where there was such a rise in literacy. There was also this kind of an interest among those people, the mass literates, in other words, who would like to read these kind of sensational narratives, and the penny gaffs, the penny dreadfuls, the shilling shockers. So you see, for a penny, for a shilling, you could buy these novels, which were of course not written by Dickens or Reynolds, but they were written by again hack writers, and this was again very kind of an subculture which was common in the Victorian publishing world. But what was important was that the crime was something which was attractive to the common literate masses, and the popularity of novel as a form in the 19th century allowed these kinds of novels to emerge, of which we know of the sensation fiction. And as Lynn Pikett, who is a very well known researcher on sensation fiction of the Victorian period, she says that yes, in these novels, what we come across is this kind of vilification and a kind of an exposure uh, of domestic cultures and crime, where often women were projected as criminals. And since in the middle of the 19th century itself, there was this parliamentary debate over the woman question, and a lot of these people in and around, say, if you think of the reformers, they wanted to change the way women were in Victorian times. They wanted to empower women educationally. They wanted to empower women in terms of their cultural orientations and their vocations and their maybe their legal rights also. So this kind of an empowerment was seen as a kind of a double-edged thing, because if women get empowered, of course there was this chance that their output would produce social progress, but at the same time women were also seen as disruptive, as capable of sort of regressing into psychological disorder, and they were also seen as a threat to the status quo of patriarchal society. And since in the Victorian period there was such an emphasis on bourgeois values, so it was always important to project the image of the quote unquote angel of the house, as opposed to the monstrous, demonized other woman who is largely not a Madonna but a Magdalene. Right. So these constructs were also shaken by the reforms that were in mind, and therefore this pervasive fear that women, if they get all independence and their self-reliance and their autonomy, they can also turn out to be monstrous and dangerous. And this was one of the latent fears of Victorian patriarchy. With that kind of a ideological background, when Peter Ackroyd is writing about Elizabeth Cree, because when this novel, Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, it released in 1994, then in America it was released under the name of The Trial of Mrs. Cree. And therefore, it was like many of those writings about the Neo Victorians, and this is a kind of a flourishing subgenre of British Anglophone fiction and British fiction, and since the 1960s and maybe in the 1980s and 90s it became more steadier. And in this segment you will find the writings of Robert Muscat, who writes Heathen and Outcast and The Defiance of Mary Ball in 2013, and both these novels are about real life stories of criminals like Mary Ball who had actually killed her husband, and what was the truth behind her criminality. Where you will find that Muscat is saying that yes, she was a criminal in legal terms because she has murdered. But again, behind that murder, there was this back history of lot of domestic violence, repression, torture, and deprivation that she was subjected to by years by her husband. And so when she actually got provoked and killed him, then there was a legal uproar and she was hanged. And this notion of hanging of criminals and making it into a public spectacle itself was something very gruesome. And it was something that happened in case of Mary Ball. And what the author Muscat is trying to underscore is the fact that this is kind of a demonization of women when they commit crimes and the way in which they were kept in the asylums and the way they were treated that and the prisons also that was indicative of this kind of an inhumanity and self contradiction of Victorian patriarchy. And therefore, if you also read the novels of Sarah Waters, like, say, for example, she has this neo Victorian trilogy. The first novel is Tipping the Velvet, which is not so about crime, but it's about the London underworld and the urban world and the urban world of emerging entertainment. And then, of course, there are glimpses of urbanity in Affinity, but more than that, Fingersmith. If you read Fingersmith, it is almost like Oliver Twist. It's a very Dickensian narrative, and there we find that this kind of a discussion and this connection that she builds up between crime and women and there be having alternative sexual preferences was also seen as something unquestionably wrong and this equation of where women with criminality was also very strong. So with those kinds of constructs which were available in the Victorian period, then Ackroyd, Waters, and Muscat, they, in their own ways, when they have described women criminals and their lives, they have always tried to show that it was not so much harmful and dangerous as they were projected in the Victorian period. And they deserved a kind of a sympathy and their story needs to be retrieved and retold to the postmodern audience so that with all our modernity and with all our kind of openness and flexibility and ideological emancipation we can feel about these Victorian women and their problems and their the kind of hypocrisy and sexual double standard that they were subjected to by Victorian men. And with this context, if you think of this novel, I come back to Peter Ackroyd's Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, then you will find that it is a novel which has Dan Leno, a historical figure. We know that Dan Leno was a great performer of the London stage. He was a great actor. He did many public shows, and he was um, a kind of an artist who was looked up to as one of those icons of emerging Victorian popular culture. And in case of Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, again, what we see is that in the British title, in the British release, there is no reference to Elizabeth Creek and instead there is a reference to Leno and the Golem. And these are very interesting connections that the novel builds up with Mrs. Creek. Right. Say, for example, now if we think of what the Ackroyd critics say, and I'm going to quote from one of his very well-known critics who says that in Ackroyd's novel, there is a permutation of the possible and impossible, the relevant and irrelevant, true and false, fiction and history, fact and reality. And therefore, in other words, you can see that Ackroyd writes this novel in such a way that it uses historical records, legal records, it uses inspectors' diary records, it uses a journal written by Mrs. Cree's husband, John Cree. And again, by sort of making use of all these kind of narrative protocols, Ackroyd does point out that there are these moments of historical relativization where truth and fiction cannot always be separated from each other. And often, many of these documents that he produces in the text appears to have a kind of a porous relationship between truth and falsity. And what is very interesting about this novel is that it has, apart from Dan Leno, the historical characters of Karl Marx and George Gissing, and here we find that these characters, they are seen researching in the London Library of the British Museum, and they are researching on various kinds of aspects of the emerging popular and urban culture, of which we find that these are again characters who also kind of try to come to terms with the murders that this certain Mrs. Cree, it's not sure that whether she does them, but the novel is about investigating and proving that maybe she is the one who had done that, all those murders, and she's projected as a serial killer. And sometimes we find that in very fictional characters, not Elizabeth Cree was not a real character, but fictional characters like an Inspector Kildare, he goes around these historical characters, asking them, inquiring them about the murders that have taken place. So here, crime is invested with a certain kind of, I would say, a kind of a fear and idea that crime is not always so easy to locate. And what happens is here we see that despite the presence of these kind of very powerful historical characters, say for example, as I said, of Marx and of course Gissing, and at times we also have Babbage, who is there at that point of time inventing the analytical engine, which is a precursor of our modern computer. And of course, Dan Leno. These characters are protagonists of the historical novel. But again, they don't have so much to do in this novel as does Mrs. Cree. And this is unlike many of the other crime narratives in the Neo Victorian genre. Say, for example, if you read Matthew Pearl's The Last Dickens, or if you read novels like Dan Simmons' Drood, you will find that they foreground the way the world of crime is often a male dominated world, and their female characters are hardly there, or even if they are there as typical victims, and they are at the receiving end of situations, but not in this novel. And that is because in this novel what we come across is the fact that this woman, Elizabeth Cree, is a formidable criminal. And now, having had said that she's a criminal, that is an understatement, because she does not see herself as a criminal. She sees herself as a kind of a performer. And that's why I said that this idea that crime is a kind of a performance. Now, how she comes to this kind of a thinking about crime. Now, if we go to the childhood of Elizabeth Cree, the novelist writes that she was born to a mother as a kind of an illegitimate child, and her mother found it very difficult to make her both ends meet when she was young, and therefore she had a kind of a very difficult and neglected upbringing till her mother died. And then while she was growing up in the London streets, she had encountered poverty, sexual abuse, and all kinds of adversities, but still she managed to enter the stage, and she dreamt that she would one day become an actress. And with all her intelligence and her strong personality, she thought that she would win over the audience. But what happened is that she was not, her performances, her quality as a performer did not go well with the ordinary crowd, because while she was performing, she was not given the scope to perform at a very high culture show, but it was among the low people, the groundlings, the prostitutes, the men who thronged the streets, and they did not understand the quality of her performance, and she was like mocked at and jibed at, and she did not shine as an actress. And finally, she managed to marry this John Cree, who was a kind of a journalist and a critic and was quite well established. But then again, Mrs. Cree was not somebody who would subscribe to domestic values because of her troubled childhood. She had a very strong and dangerous abhorrence of sexuality, and therefore she would not lead a normal married life with her husband, neither be a domestic character and manage the duties of the household. So what she did was like she would get into all kinds of outdoor activities, and she would ascribe a hired servant, Aveline, not only to do all the household work but also to give company to her husband. So it happened that Aveline was this kind of a domestic self of Mrs. Cree, who never wanted to become a typically married angel of the house. Then what was she actually trying to do? That what she did was something very unusual. That she had this habit of going out to study in the London Library, and she read De Quincey's essay on the Ratcliffe Highway murders, where De Quincey compares murder with a work of art. That yes, every criminal is an artist, and she gets inspired by that. And she also has a lot of freedom in terms of her everyday life, and her husband never interferes with her activities, and therefore she goes out into nightly sojourns. And what she does is to she ends up killing prostitutes because these prostitutes had once derided her performance on stage and had stood between her dream of becoming an actress. Then she is an anti Semitic, and therefore she murders the Jewish scholar Solomon Weil. And then she has to create some kind of a random fear, and therefore she murders the Gerard family. They are very innocent people. And by turns, by murdering so many people at a time, then it becomes a kind of a celebration of certain kind of monstrosity for her, and she's trying to find a sublimation of her negative potential, her energy in these murders. And finally, she also murders her husband, John Cree. And she also, to confound people, writes a journal under the name of John Cree, and it appears to the court that maybe she has not murdered any of these people, but maybe John Cree had done. So she is exactly like we can think of John Fowles's Sarah Woodruff in Lethbridge Lieutenant's Woman, who's not a criminal, but she was good in terms of inventing her identity. She almost invented her identity as a fallen woman and was playing around with that idea. And similarly, here we find that this woman, Elizabeth Cree, is such a strong and powerful presence that she invents her identity almost, and people think that it is the mythical creature golem which is murdering, and maybe it's a kind of a Jack the Ripper kind of a figure who does all kinds of these activities. And it is again very difficult to find from any of these murders that a woman does them. Then, in the novel, if you think that the comparisons that are raised between the golem, the monster, and Elizabeth Cree, and let me read a little bit of those sections where Ackroyd is saying, who now remembers the story of the Limehouse golem, or cares to be reminded of the history of that mythical creature, the secret of how it came to be revived in the last decades of the 19th century, and how it aroused the same anxieties and horrors as its medieval counterpart, is to be found within the annals of London's past. So now you see that how Ackroyd connects that kind of a London tradition of a crime fiction with that of the murders of Mrs. Creed. And if you go to chapter 19 of the novel, you will find that the mutual identification of the golem with the secret self of London is strengthened by the observations that Marx makes. And it's not sure that Karl Marx makes these observations, but we see that Ackroyd uses this kind of a situation to invent certain observations. So, in the intonation of Golem, the public may have divined the horror of an artificial life and a form without a spirit, the cadence and inflection of the word echoing and mocking soul. It was an emblem of the city which surrounded them, and the search for the Limehouse Golem became, curiously enough, a search for the secret self of London itself. So you see that this constant coupling of crime, of a certain kind of sense of artifice and a sense of technological or mythological fear of something unknown pervading the city and hence the criminal world. And then also we see that Dr. Paley, a fictional character again, is presented as an expert in the old folklore of Europe. And his opinion is also given in chapter 37. Says, he sees no reason why it should not be made out of stone or metal. He's talking about the golem or some other durable metal. He adds, horrible dictu, that it is also able to change its shape at will. He further informs us that the golem is always created within great cities and by some awful instinct is thoroughly acquainted with the streets and alleys of its birthplace. So you see that this idea that when Victorian science was making so much of progress and there were so many inventions in terms of technocratization and urbanization and factory culture was becoming stronger day by day and London was becoming a hub of all these kind of scientific activities, then we also find that there's this fear that there might be a revival of some mythological creatures like the golem who can destroy the spirit of London or who can wreak this kind of an havoc by doing all these murders, which are extremely unwelcome and disturbing and disruptive for an emerging city. But then again, what we also find is the fact that then why is there such an emphasis on Mrs. Cree's murders, and why is there such a zeal also to sort of identify and punish her? It is also because that, of course, the golem is just a kind of a mass euphoria and a product of the horrible cultural imaginary of the city people. It really does not do the murders, and it's all done by Mrs. Cree. And what we also find is that when she is brought before the judge and she is tried, if you read the trial scenes, you will find that she is an extremely unrepentant, strong character who never sort of sees any of these activities as false or wrong or something culpable because she has a distorted sense of morality. Maybe she does things which are not always acceptable or supportable. But again, what Ackroyd refrains from doing, being a postmodern writer, that he does not end up writing a didactic narrative about how a woman criminal was punished because she was so gruesome and she was so dangerous and that she needed to be exposed and expelled in order to sort of bring about a sense of justice in the narrative. So you see that when the story of Elizabeth Cree, she becomes so popular that she becomes a character finally on the London stage, where when she finishes Misery Junction, a play which John Cree left unfinished, and the play, The Crease of Misery Junction, is performed, and then Dan Leno agrees to play the character of Elizabeth Cree in that play. And what we see is that while on the other hand there is the legal punishment and hanging of the trial of Mr. Cree that takes place for several weeks and months, and finally the hanging. What we see is that there is again this kind of a mitigation of that horror, as one of the early Ackroyd critics, Susan Honegger, points out, that there is this mitigation of the horror of all the killings and her death with a joyous celebration on stage of the stories of the Cree family of John Cree and Elizabeth Cree, and how many things had gone wrong in their lives to produce such a kind of a web of crime. And the fact that certain repairological critics who have done their work on Jack the Ripper murders in London, they have also pointed out that often it was thought that maybe Jack the Ripper was a woman. And when Ackroyd is writing this novel, he is also uh, keeping in mind that kind of a narrative pattern where Jack the Ripper does these serial killings, and then it is the Limehouse Golem which can be assigned a kind of a agency, a supernatural agency, instead of Mrs. Cree. So again, when we call it the Limehouse Golem, if you go and visit London, I remember when I went to London for the first time, when I saw Limehouse, like I could identify, right, these are the seedy regions of London from which crime was so copious, and therefore the golem, who was seen as a monster, could emerge from that poverty, that corruption, and that kind of an underworld, which was necessarily associated with lost dreams, with broken lives, with thwarted ambitions, and of lives unfinished and tragic, like that of John Cree and Elizabeth Cree. And in that kind of an atmosphere of a city, when on the one hand there was so much of prosperity and imperial power and success signified by London in the 19th century, then also there are these dark underbellies of criminal subculture of such women like Elizabeth Cree, with their troubled and traumatic pasts and their difficult psychological states, who exist in that kind of a London environment. And Peter Ackroyd, having written about Mrs. Cree, he is trying to say that this is that kind of a London that is often represented in certain paintings and novels. And that is one tradition which tries to point out that there was this kind of a very disturbing impact of women criminals and women as criminals, and women when they were criminalized, or they were forced into asylums, they were converted into quote unquote mad women in the attic. And this was something which often was a product of deprivation, again a subjugation, and Victorian patriarchy with all its hypocrisy had such double standards that it was very difficult for women to actually maintain their balance, their sanity, their mental equilibrium. And if they did something disruptive or lost their mind, then also the situation did not allow any scope for any sympathy or any humanity. So, while writing about Peter Ackroyd, about Mrs. Cree, who is an imaginary character, Peter Ackroyd tries to project a woman who does not repent the way she takes a kind of a revenge against this kind of a patriarchal culture dominated by the rich bourgeoisie, where maybe as a woman and as impoverished person from an impoverished background, she doesn't have any space. And so this novel is actually a kind of a narrative of resistance of Mrs. Cree against the predominant trends and orientations of Victorian patriarchy and Victorian bourgeoisie. So, with these words, I would like to end my lecture. And now I expect that some of you will come up with their questions. Thank you.
Good evening, ma'am. At this point in time, I did not find any questions. While we can wait for them, we
Hmm.
can. I can like. I have an observation or a
Yes.
query
Yes.
that from your presentation, because I have not been able to read Ackroyd yet, but it
Hmm.
seems that the focus of the crime is
Hmm.
in the cities, and
Hmm.
is this in some way a fallout of the industrial revolution? Is there any sign that this happens, and what is your view about that?
Right, good question. Even if you have not read much of Ackroyd. Now, of course, I appreciate the fact that while we make these connections between the way in which the Industrial Revolution was not a kind of a meta-narrative of progress as it is always projected as a kind of an offshoot of Enlightenment modernity that science was achieving, and then there we had this kind of world's first most progressive city in the 19th century London. But again, there are many of these, as you have said, if you read the works of Dickens or the writings of Mayhew, you will find that they do point out that there is so much of poverty, there is so much of deprivation and suffering of London poor, who are essentially factory laborers and thriving on various aspects of the industry and its manifestations and the urban context of work and the way in which laborers they suffer in the back streets of London. Of course, this is a very potent connection, and there are many crime narratives of the penny gaffs, penny dreadfuls, and shilling shockers, which contextualize themselves in the urban world. But in this novel, the connection between industrialization and Mrs. Cree's crime is not very strong, except for the fact that, yes, of course, when Ackroyd is making references to the Babbage's analytical engine, which was being invented at that point of time, he is referring to that kind of a cold heartlessness and the calculating nature of machines, which often define London in the 19th century, as opposed to the warmth of the ordinary people and their sufferings and their lives and their proximities and their little narratives that throng the streets of London. So, yes, there is a kind of a disruption between the way in which crime is articulated in this novel, the disjunction between the way in which the rich, the privileged, the bourgeois ruling people they operate and they enjoy the privileges of the industrial revolution as opposed to those at the receiving end of it. And maybe Elizabeth Free is also a part of that, as I said, of that kind of a culture of the underprivileged. And she been born a kind of a illegitimate child, and she has many, as I said, many seedy and traumatic experiences of abuse and discrimination in her childhood. So, of course, she is an offshoot of that kind of a divided culture of divided resources. Yes. Okay. So, are there any questions, or if there are
Let
not?
me check once.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the Facebook live chat right now.
Okay.
I'm sure that your presentation was like so clear and lucid that there is no room for questions by the listeners. But since this video is going to stay for a long time in the Facebook, there will be queries and questions which I will forward to you via email or
Okay.
Facebook messages. And one of the general questions is more information about Peter Ackroyd and more critical information like books which were published.
Oh,
As you mentioned, there are a number of critics on Peter
yes.
Ackroyd. We might want to have a list if you can provide it at a later date, which can be followed by the students. And in the very beginning, you pointed out that the students are unaware of the writing of
Yes.
Peter Ackroyd, me being
Yes.
one,
Mostly
because
so.
I
Yeah,
did
that is
not
how the
know about it.
curriculum is structured, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I
that is
mean,
how.
as crime is a kind of a subaltern area or space, so it was not given any space in the canonized structure of
No, I don't
undergraduate
think it's
postgraduate
because of
studies.
crime only, because he's not writing about crime only, but there is, as I said, a kind of a post-colonial turn, which the syllabi in Indian and subcontinental universities and colleges and higher institutions, that they wanted to emphasize more on the writings of these Anglophone writers and their post-colonial narratives. And so, something which is related only to the British and to the London tradition, as Ackroyd is a white British novelist, and so is Byatt and Graham Swift, and so many of these very prolific writers, but they are not so popular, is again because of the kind of ideological and orientation that they have. That they are largely writing about Britain, and they are insiders, and they are white writers. So there is a shift from the white to the multicultural writers. So you will know more of Z.D. Smith and Hanif Qureshi or Ben Okri or Timothy Mo, Kazuo Ishiguro than you would know of their contemporary, British contemporaries like Ackroyd and Byatt or any of these other very prolific writers in the British postmodern canon or they are contemporary writers in history. Right.
Yeah,
So that
that's
is
a
the
great
kind of a
point.
divide that happens. It's all because the empire writes back and the empire wants to overwrite. And so we don't hear so much about the post-imperial voices. Right? That's what I was trying to point out. But again, if you go to a British university, you will see that no, they have these structured courses, and there's a lot of research work from Cambridge University Press or from Palgrave, uh, primarily British press, critical publishing houses on these post-imperial and postmodern contemporary British novels, Anglophone and otherwise, right? So there are these many trends, and this is one of those trends, right, which is not so popular in the Indian subcontinent. And when I was doing my PhD, like I thought, right, then I would like to go and explore this trend because everybody is doing research only on post-colonial studies almost. If they were not working on Renaissance or the Victorian or the Romantic period. I do also talk about the 19th century, but in a very vicarious and indirect way. My main area of research is, of course, contemporary British, white British fiction, and maybe multicultural fiction, because you cannot really say white British because you have Carol Phillips or Peter Carey or Margaret Atwood, who also write these neo Victorian narratives about the Victorians, and which is largely against the Victorians. Right. So it's not like how Peter Ackroyd or Byatt will write. And this interplay is very interesting. Okay.
Definitely.
So, so
Thank
I
you so
think
much,
we,
ma'am,
yeah, welcome.
for these deliberations and for taking up Peter Ackroyd. We will have new things to explore. And as I said, as I pointed out, this presentation was very lucid in terms of its aims and the descriptions which you provided. And the interpretations were really very clear, and thank you so much for giving us such a valuable chunk of your time for this talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, all the best with your platform. I hope it grows very well and does many such series. And also, thank you again for inviting me and welcome for all the good things that you have said about me. Okay,
Thank
so
you
with
so
that,
much,
I
ma'am,
think,
and yeah, we will look forward to more talks from you in recent future, and we
okay,
will be seeing more of you. Thank you so
okay,
much.
okay,
So with
goodbye.
that,
So
I would
goodbye.
yes, ma'am.
Hmm. So can we switch off and get
Yes,
out of
yes.
this? Yeah. So
You may switch off your camera, and you
I'm
may leave if you
oh
wish. You may leave the studio for now. Thank you so much.
okay. I think it's nearly time. It's almost
Yeah, it's nearly
7:18.
time, and I'll
Yeah.
just wrap up by saying that thank you all for being here, and we will see other speakers, including Sneha ma'am, soon. Stay tuned and have a good night.
Oh, good.
Good night.